The air was thick with summer humidity as we walked up the cobblestone driveway to the Aldridge estate. In the fading light of early evening, the grand colonial mansion stood like a sentinel over the manicured lawn, its windows glowing faintly with warm yellow light. It would have been a picturesque scene if not for the weight hanging in the air, an unspoken tension that prickled the back of my neck. Death had visited here, and even the swaying oak trees seemed to bow in solemn acknowledgement. Elliot Brooks moved with his characteristic purposefulness, his broad frame outlined against the dusk as his trench coat fluttered behind him. His steps were deliberate, as though each stride was calculated to absorb the surroundings. I trailed behind him, adjusting my tie, the fabric already damp against my skin. My role in these situations was never quite as dynamic as Elliot's, but I had grown accustomed to his pace, his unwavering focus. The door swung open before we could knock. Evelyn Aldridge stood there, her face pale but composed, her auburn hair immaculately styled. She wore a fitted black dress, sharp at the shoulders, a deliberate choice that made her appear regal in her grief. But her eyes, they betrayed her. They were rimmed with red, and though she carried herself with dignity, I could see the cracks forming in her facade. "Mr. Brooks," she said softly, her voice steady but barely above a whisper. Her eyes flicked to me for a moment, a faint nod acknowledging my presence, before returning to Elliot. "Thank you for coming. Please, come in." Elliot tipped his hat and stepped inside without a word. I followed him into the foyer, where the scent of fresh lilies greeted us, a sharp, floral intrusion that clung to the air. The house was as grand as I remembered from previous visits. High ceilings adorned with intricate plasterwork, a chandelier glittering above the polished parquet floor, and walls lined with oil paintings of pastoral landscapes. But tonight, all its splendor seemed to fade into irrelevance. "This way," Evelyn said, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she led us down a long hallway. It was eerily quiet, save for the muffled whispers of the uniformed officers stationed near the doorway at the end of the hall. As we approached, they straightened, their expressions stoic but respectful. They had clearly been briefed on who Elliot was, or more importantly, the kind of man he was. The study was a large room, its walls lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that seemed to sag under the weight of their contents. A massive oak desk sat in the center, its surface cluttered with papers, a silver fountain pen, and an empty whiskey tumbler. But it was the chaise lounge near the fireplace that drew all attention. Jonathan Aldridge lay there, his head resting awkwardly against the armrest. His face was pale, waxy, and his eyes stared blankly at the ornate ceiling above. Someone, likely Evelyn, had draped a quilt over his legs, a gesture that struck me as oddly tender given the circumstances. "He was a healthy man," Evelyn began, her voice trembling now as she stood in the doorway. "The doctors said he had the heart of a man 10 years younger. And yet," she trailed off, her hand clutching a delicate handkerchief. Elliot crouched beside the chaise lounge, studying the body with a clinical detachment that I found both admirable and unsettling. He didn't touch anything, not yet. His eyes darted from Jonathan's hands, loosely folded over his abdomen, to the faint discoloration around his lips. His gaze lingered on the quilt for a moment before shifting to the ashtray on the nearby side table, where the remnants of a half-smoked cigar sat nestled among the ashes. "When did you find him?" Elliot asked, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "Just after 7 this evening," Evelyn replied. "He spent most of the day in here, preparing for tomorrow's rally. I checked on him, as I often do, and and I knew something was wrong the moment I saw him. Her voice wavered, and she turned away, dabbing at her eyes with the handkerchief. And no one else was in the house at the time? Elliot continued, his tone calm but probing. No, the staff had left early, as per Jonathan's request. He wanted privacy to work. Elliot nodded, his expression giving nothing away. He leaned closer to the chaise, his sharp eyes narrowing as he examined the faint sheen of perspiration on Jonathan's forehead. "Miguel," he said without looking up, "what do you make of the room?" I swallowed, stepping closer to the desk. It was always a strange feeling, being called upon in these moments. An odd blend of eagerness and trepidation. My gaze swept over the surface, taking in the papers strewn about, the open ledger, the book lying face down with its spine creased. "It's untidy, but not in a frantic way," I said slowly, almost as if he were in the middle of something and intended to return to it. Elliot nodded slightly, his approval subtle but evident. He moved to the desk, carefully avoiding disturbing anything as he picked up a small envelope addressed in elegant handwriting. "You mentioned he was preparing for a rally," he said to Evelyn. "Did he seem anxious? Worried about anything?" Evelyn hesitated, her fingers twisting the fabric of her handkerchief. "He always felt pressure during the campaign, of course, but nothing unusual, nothing he couldn't handle. He was determined more than anything." Elliot held her gaze for a moment, as if weighing her words. Then he turned back to the body, his eyes narrowing as they focused on the faint discoloration around Jonathan's mouth. He leaned in closer, his face mere inches from the deceased man's lips. "Do you smell that?" he asked suddenly, looking over his shoulder at me. I stepped closer, hesitant but curious. As I inhaled, a faint, bitter odor reached my nose, subtle but distinct. "Almonds," I said, the word escaping my lips before I could stop it. My stomach tightened. I knew enough from my time with Elliot to recognize the implications. Elliot nodded, his expression grave. "Cyanide," he murmured. "It's faint, but it's there." Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Poison? But why?" Elliot stood, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her take a step back. "That's what we intend to find out, Mrs. Aldridge. But rest assured, your husband didn't die of natural causes." The room seemed to grow colder in that moment, the weight of Elliot's words settling over us like a shroud. Evelyn swayed slightly, and I instinctively stepped forward, steadying her with a hand on her arm. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and brimming with tears. "Please," she whispered, her composure crumbling. "Find out who did this. Jonathan was a good man. He didn't deserve this." "We will," Elliot said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "But I'll need full access to his records, his correspondence, his schedule, anything that might help us understand who would want him dead." Evelyn nodded, her grip tightening on the handkerchief. "Anything you need," she said. "Just find the truth." Elliot didn't respond. He was already moving, his sharp gaze sweeping over the room as if cataloging every detail, every possible clue. I watched him, feeling the familiar mix of awe and unease that always accompanied his investigations. He had a way of peeling back the layers of a situation, exposing the raw, messy truths hidden beneath. It was both fascinating and terrifying. As the night stretched on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing at the edge of something vast and dangerous, a web of secrets waiting to ensnare us. But if there was anyone who could untangle it, it was Elliot Brooks, and I would follow him into the heart of it, wherever it might lead. The night outside had deepened, the oppressive summer heat finally giving way to a cooler breeze, but inside the Aldridge estate, the air remained thick with tension. After Elliot's grim pronouncement that Jonathan Aldridge had been poisoned, the room fell into a silence so profound that even the faint ticking of the study's clock seemed deafening. Evelyn Aldridge had retired to her sitting room, her frail composure cracking under the strain. Elliot had insisted she leave us alone to work, his tone polite but firm. He wasn't one to coddle, not even a grieving widow. We stayed behind in the study, the scene still and untouched, save for the faint rustling as Elliot moved about. His sharp eyes swept across every inch of the room, cataloging details as if the space were speaking to him in a language only he could understand. I lingered near the desk, the unease from earlier settling deeper into my chest. There was something about this room, the way the shadows pooled in the corners, the scent of cigar smoke mingling with the faint traces of almonds, that made it hard to shake the feeling that we were being watched, even though I knew it was impossible. "Miguel?" Elliot's voice broke the silence, pulling me back from my thoughts. He was crouched near the chaise lounge where Jonathan's body still rested, his fingers hovering near the edge of the quilt. "What do you notice about this?" I stepped closer, my eyes falling to the quilt in question. It was an elaborate piece, hand-stitched with intricate patterns of leaves and flowers, the kind of heirloom one might find draped over a family armchair. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable, but as I studied it more closely, I realized what Elliot was pointing toward. The edges of the fabric didn't lie flat. There was a slight bulge underneath, something concealed between the folds. "Something's hidden," I said, keeping my voice low as if speaking too loudly might disrupt the stillness of the room. "Did Evelyn mention moving anything?" "She claimed the scene was exactly as she found it," Elliot replied, his tone laced with skepticism. He reached into his coat pocket, producing a pair of gloves, which he slipped on with practiced precision. Carefully, he lifted the quilt, peeling it back to reveal what lay beneath. It was a book, a small, leather-bound journal, its edges worn with use. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. Elliot picked it up, turning it over in his hands before flipping it open. The pages were filled with dense, looping handwriting, the kind that suggested its writer had plenty to say and not enough time to say it. "Jonathan's journal," Elliot muttered, his brow furrowing as he scanned the pages. He moved to the desk, setting the journal down beneath the lamplight for a closer inspection. I leaned over his shoulder, my curiosity piqued despite the unease coiling in my stomach. The entries were detailed, chronicling Jonathan's thoughts on his campaign, his strategies, and his interactions with various figures in Washington's political scene. But as we flipped through the pages, a pattern began to emerge. Mentions of an anonymous correspondent, someone Jonathan referred to only as M. "Received another letter from M today," Elliot read aloud, his voice steady despite the tension building in the room. "They insist on meeting in person, but I'm not sure I can risk it. Evelyn would never forgive me." I glanced at Elliot, my mind racing. "Who's M?" I asked. "And why would Jonathan hide this journal?" "Two good questions," Elliot replied, his tone suggesting he already had a dozen theories forming in his mind. "Unfortunately, the journal doesn't give us much to go on. No full names, no details about these letters. Just vague references and half-expressed thoughts." He closed the journal, his expression darkening. But if Jonathan felt the need to hide this, if he feared his wife's reaction, then we're looking at something more than idle correspondence. This M could be the key to understanding why he was killed. The sound of footsteps in the hallway drew our attention, cutting through the charged silence. A moment later, one of the uniformed officers appeared in the doorway, his expression stiff but uncertain. He cleared his throat before speaking. "Mr. Brooks, Mrs. Aldridge asked me to inform you that the coroner has arrived. They're ready to remove the body whenever you give the go-ahead." Elliot nodded, though his focus remained on the journal. "Tell them to wait. I'm not done here." The officer hesitated, glancing at me as if hoping I might intercede, but I only shrugged. If there was one thing I'd learned in my time with Elliot, it was that his authority in situations like this was absolute. The officer left without another word, his footsteps retreating down the hallway. Elliot straightened, tucking the journal into his coat pocket. "We've seen enough here for now," he said, his tone brisk. "Let's talk to Evelyn." I followed him out of the study, the tension in my chest not easing even as we stepped into the brightly lit hallway. The house seemed quieter now, the heavy atmosphere of the study lingering in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. Evelyn was waiting for us in the sitting room, perched on the edge of an overstuffed armchair. A glass of brandy sat untouched on the table beside her, the amber liquid catching the light. She looked up as we entered, her eyes red and puffy but her composure largely intact. "Did you find anything?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We're still piecing things together," Elliot replied, his tone carefully neutral. "But I need to ask you about something we found in the study, a journal. Jonathan's journal." Evelyn blinked, her expression shifting to one of confusion. "A journal? I didn't know Jonathan kept a journal. Are you sure it's his?" Elliot's gaze was unyielding, his eyes searching her face for any sign of deception. "Positive. It contains detailed entries about his campaign, as well as mentions of someone referred to as him. Does that mean anything to you?" Evelyn's brow furrowed, and she shook her head slowly. "No, I can't think of anyone. Jonathan was always meeting with people, exchanging letters. It was part of his work. But I've never heard of anyone called M." Her answer seemed genuine, but I couldn't help noticing the way her fingers gripped the armrest of the chair, her knuckles turning white. Elliot must have noticed too, though he didn't press the issue. Instead, he nodded and turned to me. "Miguel, let's step outside for a moment. There's something I'd like to discuss." It wasn't a request. I followed him out to the front porch, the cool night air a welcome relief after the stifling tension of the house. The city stretched out before us, its lights twinkling in the distance, a stark contrast to the darkness that seemed to envelop the Aldridge estate. "What do you think?" Elliot asked, leaning against one of the porch's white columns. "Does she strike you as honest?" I considered the question carefully. "She seems genuine enough," I said, "but there's something she's not telling us. Whether it's about the journal or something else, I can't say." Elliot nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Agreed. Evelyn Aldridge is many things, but a simple grieving widow isn't one of them. There's more to her than meets the eye." He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the journal once more. "And if Jonathan's cryptic entries are any indication, this M person is the missing piece. Whoever they are, they've either got answers, or they're the reason Jonathan Aldridge is dead." The night deepened around us, the shadows stretching long across the lawn. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of the case settling heavily between us. I could feel it in my chest, that familiar mix of anticipation and dread. We were only at the beginning, and already the path ahead seemed fraught with danger. Elliot straightened, tucking the journal away. "We've got work to do," he said simply. And with that, we stepped off the porch and back into the fray. We arrived at the sleek black sedan parked under the sprawling oak trees lining the Aldridge Estate's driveway. Elliot's gloved hands moved efficiently as he rifled through the passenger seat, retrieving a small leather-bound notebook in which he meticulously recorded the pertinent findings of every investigation. Moonlight glinted off the brass clasp of the notebook as he flipped it open to a clean page, his fountain pen poised. The air carried the scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass, a deceptively tranquil backdrop to the storm of intrigue brewing around us. I leaned back against the car, the cool metal pressing through my shirt. "So," I ventured, watching Elliot's concentrated frown deepen as he jotted notes. "What's the next move? This M character isn't going to conveniently walk up and introduce themselves." Elliot didn't look up, his pen gliding smoothly across the page. "We start with what we know. The letters mentioned in the journal, they'll be somewhere in that house. If we can find them, we might get a clearer sense of M's identity and their connection to Jonathan. Assuming Evelyn hasn't already burned them," I muttered. The thought of her trembling hand clutching the edges of a delicate envelope and feeding its contents to a roaring fire felt all too plausible. Elliot clicked the pen closed with a sharp snap. "Then we'd better hurry," he said simply, his tone brooking no argument. We returned to the Aldridge estate through a side entrance, a narrow corridor that smelled faintly of polish and neglect. The servants' quarters had long since emptied for the night, the muted chime of an antique clock somewhere in the distance marking the late hour. Elliot moved with the quiet precision of a cat, his footsteps almost soundless against the tiled floor. I did my best to match his stealth, though the occasional creak of my shoes betrayed me. We found ourselves in the study once more, the room unchanged from when we had left it, save for the absence of Jonathan's body, which had been discreetly removed by the coroner. The chaise lounge now seemed ghostly in its emptiness, the indented cushions a quiet reminder of the man who had so recently occupied them. Elliot moved to the desk, his sharp eyes scanning the surface for any sign of the letters. I joined him, my hands hesitating above the scattered papers before carefully picking through them. Most were mundane: a campaign itinerary, a list of donors, handwritten notes on proposed policy points. It was all meticulous and dull, the sort of paperwork I imagined Jonathan had assigned to an aide out of sheer tedium. "It's not here," Elliot muttered, his voice low but firm. "The letters wouldn't be left out in plain sight. Maybe they're in the safe?" I suggested, nodding toward the heavy steel box recessed into the wall behind the desk. Its combination lock gleamed under the lamplight, a silent challenge. Elliot's mouth quirked into a half-smile. "A reasonable deduction, Mr. Vasquez." He set to work immediately, his fingers dancing over the dial with practiced ease. I watched in fascination, marveling at his ability to manipulate the lock so effortlessly. Within moments, there was a satisfying click, and the safe swung open. Inside, there was no treasure trove of secrets, just a few envelopes, a bundle of cash, and a photograph. Elliot retrieved the envelopes first, sifting through their contents with the precision of a surgeon. Most were unremarkable: letters from constituents, a handwritten note from a fellow senator offering congratulations on a recent campaign milestone. But then, Elliot's hand paused, his fingers tightening around an envelope with no return address. The paper was yellowed, the ink faint but legible. He withdrew the letter inside, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was sharp and angular, the words succinct and devoid of pleasantries. "Jonathan," Elliot read aloud, his voice steady. "Your continued failure to meet our expectations is unacceptable. The consequences of your inaction will be severe. Act accordingly. M." The threat hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. I exhaled slowly, my breath fogging against the cool glass of the desk. "Well," I said after a moment, "if that doesn't scream blackmail, I don't know what does." Elliot's gaze was distant, his mind clearly racing. "It's more than that," he murmured. "This isn't just about leverage. M wanted something specific from Jonathan, something he wasn't willing or able to provide." I glanced at the photograph still sitting in the safe. It was old, its edges frayed, and it depicted a younger Jonathan standing beside a woman I didn't recognize. She had a confident smile and striking features, her arm looped casually through Jonathan's. Behind them, a sign reading Gibson Steelworks loomed, partially obscured by sunlight. "Who's the woman?" I asked, holding the photograph up for Elliot to see. He took it from me, studying it with an intensity that suggested he was searching for some hidden meaning in her expression. "I don't know," he admitted, which was rare enough to catch my attention. "But I intend to find out." Before we could ponder further, the sound of footsteps in the hallway reached our ears, light, hurried, and unmistakably headed in our direction. Elliot tucked the letter and photograph into his coat pocket in one fluid motion, his stance shifting subtly as though bracing for an ambush. The door swung open, and Evelyn Aldridge appeared, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes darted between us, a flicker of suspicion crossing her features before she composed herself. "What are you doing in here?" she demanded, her voice sharper than I had ever heard it. "We're investigating," Elliot replied evenly, his tone betraying neither guilt nor defiance. "This is my husband's study," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You had no right." "If you want answers, Mrs. Aldridge," Elliot interrupted, his voice cutting through hers like a scalpel, "then you'll give me the space and resources to find them. Or would you prefer the police handle this matter with the delicacy of a wrecking ball?" Evelyn's lips thinned, but she said nothing, her hands clenching the fabric of her dress. Finally, she stepped aside, allowing us to exit the study without further protest. Back in the cool night air, I felt the weight of the evening settle over me. The letters, the photograph, the veiled threats. It was all beginning to form a picture, though its full shape remained maddeningly elusive. Beside me, Elliot's expression was inscrutable, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the horizon. "The game is afoot," he said quietly, more to himself than to me. And as we climbed into the sedan and pulled away from the Aldridge estate, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger, more dangerous game. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when we found ourselves navigating the outskirts of the city, heading towards a modest industrial district on the edge of DC. The photograph we'd uncovered in Jonathan Aldridge's safe was our only lead, its faded image of a younger Jonathan beside an unfamiliar woman standing outside a factory named Gibson Steelworks. Elliot had decided, without hesitation, that the answers we needed could very well lie there. As I drove, Elliot sat beside me in his usual contemplative silence, the worn photograph clutched in his hand. His gaze flicked between the image and the passing scenery, as though each detail of the city might hold some subtle connection to the larger puzzle. I kept one eye on the road, the other on my companion, who always seemed to exist a few steps ahead of everyone else. "It doesn't add up," he murmured, breaking the silence. He turned the photograph over, examining its plain, unmarked back. Why would a man like Jonathan Aldridge, wealthy, powerful, and politically connected, keep this relic hidden away in a safe? What's its significance? I shrugged, my hands tightening around the steering wheel. Maybe it's nothing more than an old memory, something sentimental. Elliot shot me a sideways glance, one brow arching ever so slightly. Sentimentality rarely drives a man like Aldrich. Besides, hiding it suggests it's tied to something. Someone he didn't want Evelyn or anyone else to know about. The streets began to narrow, the polished facades of downtown giving way to aged brick buildings, their walls scarred with decades of soot and graffiti. The name Gibson Steelworks echoed faintly in my mind, conjuring images of smoke-belching chimneys and the rhythmic clang of hammers on metal. Yet, as we approached the address listed in an old city directory Elliot had dug up, it became clear the factory hadn't been operational for years. Its towering gates, once grand, now stood rusted and chained, the letters of its name barely visible beneath layers of grime. Elliot stepped out of the car the moment I killed the engine, his trench coat brushing against his legs as he strode toward the entrance. I followed suit, my shoes crunching against gravel as we approached the gate. Beyond it, the factory loomed like a sleeping beast, its windows shattered, its walls streaked with rust and decay. "Abandoned," I said, voicing the obvious. "For now," Elliot replied, his tone nonchalant. He reached into his coat pocket, producing a small set of tools. "But every abandoned place has its ghosts. Let's see if any are willing to talk." I couldn't help but smile at his theatrics as I watched him work the lock. It took him mere moments to undo the chain, the gate creaking open with a sound that echoed through the desolate grounds. The air inside felt different, cooler, heavier, as if it carried the weight of the factory's history. I followed Elliot through the overgrown courtyard, our footsteps stirring clouds of dust that glimmered faintly in the early light. The factory's interior was a labyrinth of machinery and shadows. Massive, rusted furnaces lined one wall, their gaping mouths silent now but still imposing. Stacks of steel beams lay scattered across the floor, their edges dulled by time. Elliot moved through it all with purpose, his sharp eyes scanning every corner, every crevice, for something, anything, that might provide a clue. It didn't take long for him to find it. Near the back of the factory, behind a row of toppled filing cabinets, we discovered a small office. Its door hung off its hinges, the wood splintered as though it had been forced open long ago. Inside, the air was thicker, the faint scent of mildew mingling with something sharper, something acrid. Elliot stepped over the threshold without hesitation, his boots stirring up a flurry of dust. The room was small, cramped, its walls lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of old ledgers and binders. A desk sat at the center, its surface buried beneath a clutter of papers and faded photographs. Elliot began to sift through them with practiced efficiency, his gloved fingers brushing aside the detritus of a bygone era. I picked up one of the photographs, its edges curling with age. It depicted a group of workers standing in front of the factory, their faces weary but proud. At the center stood the woman from Jonathan's photograph, the same confident smile, the same striking features. But now, she was surrounded by a sea of steel workers, her presence commanding yet out of place. "She's important," I said, holding up the photograph for Elliot to see. She's in this one too. Must have had some role at the factory. More than a role, Elliot muttered, his attention fixed on a ledger he had just opened. The pages were filled with neat rows of names, dates, and dollar amounts, each entry meticulously recorded. He tapped one column with his finger, his brow furrowing. These payments, they don't match the factory's operating costs. They're too regular, too substantial. Bribes, I suggested, stepping closer to peer over his shoulder. Possibly, or perhaps something more insidious. He flipped through the ledger, his movements growing more deliberate as he scanned the entries. Finally, he stopped at a name near the bottom of the page. A name circled in red ink. Margaret Lane, he read aloud, his voice cutting through the silence. That's her. The woman in the photographs? I asked, my pulse quickening. Elliot nodded, his expression unreadable. And the payments to her? Large sums every month without fail. Whatever her role here, it wasn't minor. Before we could delve further, a sound from outside the office froze us both in place. It was faint but unmistakable, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Elliot's gaze snapped to the door, his body tensing like a coiled spring. He gestured for me to stay quiet, his hand slipping into his coat, where I knew he kept a small revolver. The footsteps grew louder, closer, their uneven rhythm suggesting hesitation. My heart pounded in my chest as I pressed myself against the wall, my breath shallow and silent. Elliot positioned himself near the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he waited for the intruder to reveal themselves. And then a figure appeared. A man, middle-aged, his frame wiry but tense. He froze when he saw Elliot, his eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, no one moved, the tension in the air so thick it felt like a living thing. "Who are you?" the man demanded, his voice rough but edged with fear. "I could ask you the same," Elliot replied coolly, his hand still resting inside his coat. The man hesitated, his gaze darting between us. "You don't belong here," he said finally. "This place, it's been shut down for years. You've got no business poking around." "We're investigating Jonathan Aldridge's murder," Elliot said, his tone sharp enough to cut steel. "And from where I'm standing, it seems this factory, and its former employees, might hold some answers." The man flinched at the mention of Jonathan's name, his face paling slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Elliot took a step forward, his presence looming. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You know something, and if you don't tell me, I'll find out anyway. The choice is yours." The man swallowed hard, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of Elliot's words had physically pressed down on him. "Fine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you're playing with fire. Margaret Lane. She's not someone you want to cross. And if Aldridge got tangled up with her, then he was a fool." Elliot's eyes burned with intensity, his mind clearly racing. "Where can I find her?" he asked. The man hesitated, fear flickering across his face. But finally he relented, his voice shaking as he gave us an address. As he turned to leave, he glanced over his shoulder one last time, his expression a mixture of pity and warning. "You should walk away from this," he said. "Some secrets are better left buried." But as Elliot and I stepped back into the sunlight, the photograph and ledger clutched tightly in his hands, I knew there was no turning back. Whatever lay ahead, Margaret Lane, the payments, the truth behind Jonathan's death, we were already in too deep. The address we'd been given led us to the far side of the Anacostia River, to a neighborhood where the city's veneer of political prestige gave way to a rawer, grittier reality. The streets were narrow and crowded with parked cars, many of them rusted and worn, bearing the scars of years of neglect. The buildings lining the sidewalks were modest, their brick facades stained with the passage of time. The glow of a flickering street lamp painted the scene in shades of gray, lending the night an almost surreal quality. Elliot sat in the passenger seat, silent and focused as I pulled the sedan to a stop a block away from the address. He'd insisted we park out of sight, a precaution he rarely failed to take when approaching situations that might turn unpredictable. His trench coat was draped over his shoulders like a mantle, and even in the dim light, I could see the glint of determination in his eyes. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced countless unknowns and emerged unscathed, or at least mostly so. The building we were heading for was a small row house, its windows dark except for a faint light on the second floor. Elliot scanned the scene carefully, his gaze lingering on the surrounding alleyways and the occasional shadowy figure shuffling down the street. I could feel the tension radiating off him, a subtle but unmistakable charge in the air. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low but steady. "Always," I replied, though my stomach twisted with a familiar blend of excitement and apprehension. Being at Elliot's side during these investigations was exhilarating, but it was never without its risks. We stepped out of the car and moved quietly down the block, sticking to the shadows where the glow of the street lamps couldn't reach. The night was still, save for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. As we approached the row house, I couldn't help but notice the cracked steps leading up to the front door, the peeling paint on the window frames, a home that had seen better days. Elliot paused at the base of the steps, his hand resting lightly on the railing as he tilted his head toward the door. "No signs of forced entry," he observed, his voice barely a whisper. "Whoever's inside came in willingly or has a key." I nodded, feeling my pulse quicken. Elliot's ability to notice the smallest details never ceased to amaze me, though it often left me wondering what I might have missed. He climbed the steps slowly, his movements deliberate and silent. I followed, trying to match his careful grace, though the creak of the old wood beneath my feet betrayed me more than once. At the door, Elliot raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. His sharp eyes darted to the edges of the frame, taking in something I couldn't see. Without a word, he gestured for me to step back, and I did so without question. From his coat pocket, he produced a small set of tools, a lockpick kit well worn from years of use. Within moments, the door clicked open, and Elliot pushed it ajar with a soft creak. The air inside was heavy, carrying the faint smell of mildew and something metallic, like old coins. The hallway was narrow and dimly lit, the wallpaper faded and peeling. Elliot stepped inside first, his footsteps barely audible against the worn wooden floor. I followed close behind, my senses heightened, every creak and groan of the house amplified in the stillness. We made our way toward the faint light emanating from the second floor, climbing the staircase with measured caution. Each step felt like a small eternity, the anticipation building with every creak of the old wood beneath our weight. When we reached the landing, the source of the light became clear, a single bulb hanging from the ceiling of a small room at the end of the hall, its glow casting long shadows across the walls. Elliot moved toward the door, his movements as fluid and controlled as ever. He glanced back at me briefly, a silent reminder to stay alert, before pushing the door open with deliberate care. Inside, the room was sparsely furnished. A single chair, a small table, and a collection of papers strewn across the floor. But it was the figure seated in the chair that held our attention. Margaret Lane. Even in the dim light, there was no mistaking her. Her striking features had aged, lines etched into her face like scars of a life hard lived. Her once confident smile was absent, replaced by an expression of wary defiance. She sat upright, her hands resting on the arms of the chair, her gaze fixed on Elliot as if she'd been expecting him. "So," she said, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the silence like a knife. "You're the one poking around in places you don't belong." Elliot didn't respond immediately. He stepped further into the room, his presence commanding, though his movements remained measured. "And you're the one leaving a trail," he said, his tone calm but edged with steel. "Jonathan Aldridge, the payments, the threats, all roads lead back to you." Margaret's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something. Fear? Recognition? Crossing her face before she quickly masked it. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? But you don't know the half of it." Elliot remained unfazed, his gaze steady and unrelenting. "Then why don't you enlighten me?" For a moment, the room fell silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression hardening as though she were weighing her options. "Jonathan was a fool," she said finally, her voice bitter. "He thought he could play both sides, keep everyone happy. But in this city, you're either in or you're out. There's no middle ground." "And which side were you on?" Elliot pressed. Margaret's lips curled into a faint smirk, though it lacked warmth. "The side that pays." Elliot's eyes narrowed, his mind clearly racing to piece together the implications of her words. I watched him carefully, sensing the shift in his posture, the subtle tension in his frame. Whatever game Margaret was playing, Elliot was determined to beat her at it. Before he could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from downstairs, heavy and purposeful. Margaret's expression shifted immediately, her defiance giving way to a flicker of panic. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice low but urgent. "They're watching. They're always watching." Elliot turned to me, his gaze sharp. "Miguel, we need to move." But before we could act, the door behind us slammed shut, the room plunging into darkness as the lone bulb was extinguished. My heart raced, the sudden shift throwing me off balance. In the chaos, I heard the unmistakable sound of Margaret's chair scraping against the floor, followed by hurried footsteps. By the time I fumbled for my flashlight and clicked it on, the room was empty. Margaret was gone. Elliot cursed under his breath, his calm demeanor briefly giving way to frustration. "She knows more than she let on," he said, his voice tight. "And now she's running." I nodded, my pulse still pounding as I moved toward the door. "We'll find her," I said, more to convince myself than anything else. Elliot's expression hardened, his resolve evident. "We will. But first, we need to find out who else is in this house." The night wasn't over, not by a long shot. And as we stepped back into the hallway, the sense of danger that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over. The moment we stepped back into the hallway, the oppressive quiet of the row house weighed heavily on my senses. The sound of faint creaks and shifting wood was everywhere, indistinct yet persistent, like the building itself was alive and watching us. Elliot, ahead of me, moved with the deliberate grace of a predator, his footsteps unervingly silent against the old, warped floorboards. He held his flashlight low, the beam slicing through the gloom but never resting on any one spot for long. "She knows we're onto her," Elliot said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "She won't run far, not without tying up loose ends." "And we're those loose ends?" I asked, half joking, though the tightness in my chest betrayed my unease. Elliot didn't respond. Instead, he motioned for me to stay close as we edged toward the staircase. From somewhere below, muffled voices drifted upward, low, urgent, and impossible to make out. My pulse quickened as I strained to decipher the tone, the words, but the distance and the old walls swallowed them whole. Elliot stopped at the top of the stairs, his flashlight extinguished now, leaving us in near darkness. He tilted his head, listening, his breathing steady and unhurried. Meanwhile, I stood frozen behind him, one hand gripping the wooden railing as though it might anchor me in the growing tension. The voices faded, replaced by the soft, deliberate creak of footsteps on the floor below. Elliot tensed, his hand slipping inside his coat where I knew he kept his revolver. He turned his head slightly toward me, his expression unreadable in the dim light, but the meaning was clear. "Stay sharp." As the footsteps approached, I felt the familiar pull of adrenaline in my veins, a mix of fear and anticipation that left me jittery, yet acutely aware of every detail around me. The faint rustle of fabric, the metallic scent of dust and old wood, even the rhythmic pounding of my own heart in my ears, they all seemed amplified, pressing in from every angle. And then, without warning, Elliot moved. With a fluidity that seemed almost unnatural, he descended the staircase in near silence, each step calculated and deliberate. I followed, my body betraying me with the occasional groan of a loose floorboard beneath my weight. When we reached the ground floor, the hallway stretched out before us like a tunnel, its walls narrowing in the shadows. The voices were gone now, replaced by an eerie stillness that sent a shiver down my spine. Elliot scanned the corridor, his flashlight flicking on briefly to illuminate the empty space before disappearing again. He pointed toward a partially open door at the far end of the hall, its edges bathed in faint light. We moved toward it, the silence between us unbroken. As we neared the door, the smell of mildew grew stronger, mingling with the faint tang of sweat and something metallic. Blood, perhaps, though I dared not speak the thought aloud. Elliot reached the door first, pressing his back against the wall and motioning for me to do the same. He nodded toward the opening, his eyes narrowing. I peered inside, my heart leaping into my throat at the sight before me. The room was small, its walls lined with peeling wallpaper, and its single naked bulb cast harsh shadows across the floor. Margaret Lane stood in the center, her back to us, hunched over a table cluttered with papers, photographs, and a small open box. She was speaking softly, her words hurried and frantic, but there was no one else in the room, or so I thought. As my eyes adjusted to the light, I noticed the figure slumped against the far wall. A man, his hands bound and his face swollen with bruises. Blood trickled from a cut above his left eye, staining the collar of his shirt. He looked barely conscious, his head lolling to one side as though the weight of it was too much to bear. Elliot motioned for me to stay put, his body tense as he stepped into the room. The sudden creak of the floorboard beneath his weight was like a gunshot in the silence, and Margaret spun around, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, no one moved, the room frozen in a tableau of tension. "Don't," Elliot said, his voice low and commanding. as Margaret's hand darted toward the box on the table. "Whatever's in there, it's not worth your life." Margaret hesitated, her eyes darting between Elliot and the man on the floor. Her breathing was ragged, her hands trembling as she raised them slowly, palms outward. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't have a choice." "Funny," Elliot replied, taking a step closer. "That's what people always say when they've made the wrong one." Margaret's gaze hardened, a flicker of defiance returning to her eyes. "You think this is about me? You have no idea what you're dealing with." "Then enlighten me," Elliot said, his tone even. He gestured toward the man on the floor. "Who's he?" "Another one of your accomplices." She shook her head violently, her voice rising with desperation. "He's not with me, he's with them. The people who started this, the ones pulling all the strings. He's just their pawn." Elliot's eyes narrowed, his mind clearly racing as he processed her words. "And you?" he asked. "What are you?" Margaret laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and sharp. "I'm the scapegoat, detective. The one they'll blame when all of this comes crashing down. And you," she pointed at him, her finger trembling, "you've just made yourself a target." Before Elliot could respond, the man on the floor stirred, his head lifting weakly. He mumbled something incoherent, his voice barely audible, and Margaret's gaze snapped to him, her expression a mixture of fear and urgency. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You have to leave. Now." Elliot didn't move, his body coiled like a spring. "Who's coming?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she lunged toward the box on the table, her movements frantic. Elliot reacted instantly, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist, but it was too late. Her other hand closed around something inside the box, a small vial, and she brought it to her lips, swallowing its contents in one swift motion. "No!" Elliot shouted, but the damage was done. Margaret collapsed to the floor, her body convulsing as the poison took hold. I rushed to her side, but there was nothing I could do. Her eyes locked onto mine, wide with terror and regret, before they glazed over, her body going still. Elliot stood over her, his face a mask of fury and frustration. "Damn it," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. She was the only link we had. My attention shifted to the man on the floor, who had fallen silent once more. "What about him?" I asked, my voice shaking. "He's still alive." Elliot nodded, his expression grim. "For now. But if Margaret was right, we don't have much time. Whoever they are, they won't stop until we're silenced too." The weight of his words settled heavily over me as we moved to secure the man, our every movement charged with the knowledge that the clock was ticking. The night was far from over, and the shadows that had been circling us since this case began were closing in fast. The night air outside the row house had turned sharper, tinged with a metallic bite that matched the palpable tension crackling between Elliot and me. We had the battered man slumped in the back seat of the sedan now, his breathing shallow, his head lolling like it weighed more than his body could manage. I kept glancing over my shoulder at him as I drove through the shadowy streets, the old car rumbling beneath us, struggling to mask the questions running rampant in my mind. He hadn't spoken a word since we'd cut the ropes binding his wrists and hoisted him to his feet, and I couldn't decide if that was a result of fear, pain, or some heavier, darker secret that kept his lips sealed. Elliot, seated in the passenger seat, was unnervingly quiet. his jaw set in a way that told me he was piecing together the intricate threads of the night's revelations. His hands rested on his knees, gloved and steady, but his fingers twitched ever so slightly, a subtle giveaway that his mind was racing with calculations, probabilities, and plans. Between us, on the seat, lay Margaret Lane's empty vial, the poison she'd swallowed glinting with an almost mocking clarity in the faint light that passed through the windows. She knew what was coming, I finally said, breaking the silence. My voice felt small against the weight of everything unspoken in the car. Margaret, whatever she was caught up in, she knew her time was running out. She knew, Elliot confirmed, his voice low and deliberate, because she was a cog in a much larger machine, a machine Jonathan Aldridge found himself tangled in as well. His eyes flicked toward the back seat, where our silent passenger remained unmoving except for the faint rise and fall of his chest. And he might just be the key to understanding that machine. Assuming he survives the night, I said, glancing back again. The man's face was a patchwork of bruises and cuts, his clothes disheveled and blood-stained. He looked like he'd been through hell, and I wondered, not for the first time, what role he had played in the labyrinthine mess we were uncovering. Victim? Perpetrator? Something in between? Elliot leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze fixed ahead. "He'll survive," he said with a certainty that felt like a command rather than a prediction. "Because he has to. There are too many questions hanging in the air, and he's the only one left who might have answers." I didn't respond, but the weight of his words settled over me like a leaden blanket. The man in the back seat wasn't just another piece of the puzzle. He was the thread that could unravel the entire thing, or tangle it further. We pulled into the driveway of Elliot's office building, a nondescript brick structure tucked away on a quiet side street. The glow of a single street lamp bathed the facade in a soft amber light, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. I turned off the engine, and for a moment, we sat in silence, the hum of the car fading into the stillness of the night. "Help me get him inside," Elliot said finally, his voice cutting through the quiet. He was already out of the car before I could reply, opening the back door and reaching for our passenger. The man stirred weakly, letting out a low groan as Elliot and I hauled him to his feet. His legs barely held him, and we had to half-drag, half-carry him up the narrow stairs to the office. Inside, the space was dimly lit, the familiar smell of old paper and pipe tobacco filling the air. Elliot's desk sat in its usual state of calculated chaos, papers and notebooks scattered across the surface like the remnants of some ongoing battle. We laid the man on the worn leather couch against the far wall, and he let out a sharp breath, his head lolling to one side. Elliot knelt beside him, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man's injuries. "He needs water," he said without looking at me. I moved to the small kitchenette in the corner, filling a glass from the tap. The water was cold against my fingers, grounding me for a moment before I turned back and handed it to Elliot. He held it to the man's lips, coaxing him to drink. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't respond, but then his cracked lips parted, and he took a few tentative sips. "Who are you?" Elliot asked, his voice low but commanding, as though the sheer force of it could pull the answers from the man's battered body. "Why were you at that house with Margaret Lane?" The man didn't respond at first. His head lolled slightly, his swollen eyes flickering open just enough to take in the room around him. When his gaze finally landed on Elliot, something seemed to shift. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. "Cooper," he croaked, his voice barely audible. "My name's Cooper. And what's your connection to Margaret Lane?" Elliot pressed, his tone unrelenting. Cooper let out a low, pained chuckle that turned into a cough. Blood flecked his lips, and I handed Elliot a clean handkerchief, which he pressed against the man's mouth. When Cooper finally spoke again, his words were slow and slurred, each one costing him effort. "I was her handler," he said, his eyes glazing over. "Part of the network." "What network?" I asked, unable to keep the urgency out of my voice. My heart was racing now, the pieces beginning to shift and click together in my mind. "What were you handling?" Cooper's head turned toward me, his swollen eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing whether to trust me. After a long pause, he let out a shuddering breath. "Documents," he said finally. "Records. Things people like Margaret shouldn't have seen. Things Jonathan shouldn't have seen." Elliot leaned in closer, his gaze like a blade. "What was in those records? Who's behind this?" Cooper's lips moved, but no sound came out. His chest heaved, and for a moment I thought he might lose consciousness again. But then he whispered one word, a name, that sent a chill down my spine. "Evelyn." The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation pressing down on us like a physical force. My mind raced, trying to process the implications. Evelyn Aldridge, the grieving widow, the woman who had hired Elliot to uncover the truth about her husband's death, was somehow involved? Elliot's expression remained unreadable, though I could see the wheels turning behind his sharp eyes. He stood abruptly, his long shadow stretching across the room. "He needs rest," he said, his voice tight. "We'll get more out of him when he's stronger." I nodded, though my thoughts were far from settled. As Elliot moved toward his desk, pulling out a fresh notebook and beginning to jot down notes, I found myself staring at Cooper's battered form on the couch. The name he'd given us hung in the air like a specter, impossible to ignore. Elliot glanced up at me, his expression hard. "This changes everything," he said simply. Couldn't have agreed more. The first rays of dawn crept through the thin curtains of Elliot's office, casting long streaks of light across the scattered papers and empty coffee cups littering the desk. I found myself pacing in slow circles near the window, my nerves refusing to settle even as the city outside began to awaken. The events of the past night felt like a tangled web still tightening around us, and the silence inside the room only made it worse. Cooper lay on the couch, his ragged breathing the only sound punctuating the quiet. He hadn't stirred since collapsing into unconsciousness hours ago, and though Elliot had assured me he would recover, I couldn't help but glance at him every few minutes, half expecting, or perhaps dreading, some kind of abrupt awakening. Elliot sat at his desk, his sleeves rolled up, his shirt slightly wrinkled from the long night. He had been writing in one of his notebooks for what felt like an eternity, his pen moving across the page with deliberate, steady strokes. I knew better than to interrupt him when he was in this mode, but the tension in the room was becoming unbearable. Finally, I stopped pacing and leaned against the window frame, crossing my arms over my chest. "Do you think he'll talk when he wakes up?" I asked, my voice breaking the stillness. Elliot didn't look up from his notebook. "He'll talk," he said simply, as though the matter was already decided. "The real question is whether he'll tell us anything we don't already suspect." I frowned, my gaze shifting back to Cooper's prone form. His face was a mess of bruises and cuts, his lips cracked and dry. He looked more like a victim than a conspirator, but I knew better than to let appearances cloud my judgment. "And what if he doesn't?" Depressed. What if he's just another dead end? Elliot finally set his pen down and leaned back in his chair, fixing me with one of his piercing looks. Then we keep digging, he said, his tone resolute. Every lead, every scrap of information, it all builds toward the truth. And that truth is closer than you think, Miguel. His confidence was both reassuring and maddening, as always. I let out a sigh and rubbed the back of my neck, the fatigue of the long night weighing heavily on me. Before I could respond, a soft groan from the couch drew our attention. Cooper was stirring. Elliot was on his feet in an instant, his movements calm but purposeful as he crossed the room. I followed close behind, my heart pounding in anticipation. Cooper's eyes fluttered open, bloodshot and unfocused, and he let out a low, guttural sound as he tried to sit up. "Easy," Elliot said, his voice firm but not unkind. He placed a hand on Cooper's shoulder, gently guiding him back down. "You're safe here, but we need you to answer some questions." Cooper blinked slowly, his gaze shifting between us as though trying to piece together where he was and how he had gotten here. His lips parted, but no words came out, only a dry rasp. I hurried to pour a glass of water from the carafe on the desk and handed it to him. He took it with trembling hands, spilling a few drops as he brought it to his lips. After a few tentative sips, he managed to croak out a single word. "Why?" Elliot raised an eyebrow. "Why what? Why are you doing this?" Cooper's voice was weak, but there was a hint of defiance in it, as though he were challenging us even in his vulnerable state. "You don't understand what you're up against." Elliot's expression hardened, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "Then help us understand," he said. "Tell us what you know about Margaret Lane, about Jonathan Aldridge, about Evelyn. Start at the beginning." Cooper let out a bitter laugh that quickly dissolved into a fit of coughing. I exchanged a worried glance with Elliot, but he didn't move, his focus fixed entirely on the man before us. "You think this is about politics," Cooper said between coughs, his voice rough and uneven. "It's not. It never was. Jonathan, he was just the surface. The real game is played in the shadows." "And Evelyn?" Elliot pressed. "Where does she fit into this?" Cooper's eyes flickered with something. Fear, perhaps, or regret. She's more dangerous than you realize," he said. "She's not just a grieving widow. She's—" Before he could finish, a loud crash from outside shattered the fragile stillness of the room. I spun around, my heart racing, as Elliot moved to the window in a flash. He pulled the curtain aside just enough to peer out, his body tense. "Car," he said, his voice low. "Black sedan, parked across the street." I joined him at the window, my stomach twisting as I spotted the vehicle. Its engine was still running, and though the tinted windows concealed its occupants, there was no mistaking the sense of foreboding it carried. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. "They've found us," Cooper muttered from the couch, his voice tinged with resignation. "I told you, they're always watching." Elliot turned back to him, his expression unreadable. "Who's in that car?" he demanded. "Who are they working for?" Cooper shook his head, his eyes filled with something between despair and defiance. "If I tell you, they'll kill me," he said. "And if I don't, they'll kill all of us." Elliot's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the sound of car doors slamming outside cut through the air like a gunshot. My pulse quickened as I moved toward the desk, grabbing the revolver Elliot kept in the top drawer. I wasn't a fighter by nature, But I wasn't about to sit idly by while danger closed in around us. Elliot moved to the door, his hand slipping inside his coat to retrieve his own weapon. He glanced back at me, his eyes sharp and focused. "Stay with him," he said, nodding toward Cooper. "Don't let anyone through that door." Before I could protest, he was gone, the door closing behind him with a quiet click. I stared after him for a moment, my mind racing, before turning back to Cooper. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, a mixture of fear and pity. "You should have walked away," he said softly. "You don't know what you've gotten yourselves into." "Maybe not," I replied, gripping the revolver tightly. "But we're in it now, and we're not backing down." The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway sent a chill down my spine. I positioned myself between Cooper and the door, my heart pounding as I raised the revolver. Whatever was coming, I knew Elliot wouldn't let us face it alone. But that knowledge did little to calm the storm raging within me. The web was tightening around us, and the shadows were closing in. The metallic thud of boots echoed in the narrow hallway outside Elliot's office. My pulse pounded in my ears as I tightened my grip on the revolver, my palms slick with sweat. Elliot hadn't returned yet, and each second that passed felt like an eternity stretching taut before snapping back into place. Cooper sat propped against the couch, his bruised face pale under the amber streaks of dawn spilling through the window. His eyes flitted between me and the door, wide with barely concealed panic. "They won't stop," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Not until they've silenced all of us." I wanted to dismiss him, to say something reassuring or forceful, but his words stuck to me like tar. It wasn't often that people we questioned showed this kind of fear, the deep-rooted kind that hollowed them out from within. It wasn't just fear for himself. It was fear of a machine far bigger than any of us. The doorknob jiggled slightly, and every nerve in my body tensed. Cooper shrank back into the couch, his breath shallow and erratic. My finger hovered over the trigger, a thousand thoughts crowding my mind, each one darker than the last. I glanced toward the window, gauging the height of the drop to the alley below. It wasn't impossible, but with Cooper in his condition, it would be a gamble at best. The door opened, slow and deliberate, and for a split second, I imagined a line of faceless men in dark suits standing on the other side, guns drawn. But instead, Elliot stepped into the room, his figure backlit by the dim light of the hallway. His coat was slightly rumpled, his hair slightly out of place, but his face was as composed as ever. His sharp gaze immediately took in the scene, landing on the revolver in my hands before flicking to Cooper's trembling form. "Put that down," he said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "We don't have time for panic." I exhaled slowly, lowering the weapon but keeping it within arm's reach. "What's going on out there?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Two men," Elliot replied, closing the door behind him and locking it. "They've been circling the building for the past 10 minutes, watching the exits." "Waiting for backup?" I asked. "Most likely," Elliot said. He crossed the room and knelt in front of Cooper, his expression unreadable. "We don't have long," he said. "If you want to make it out of here alive, you need to tell us everything. Right now." Cooper let out a shaky breath, his hands gripping the edge of the couch as though it were the only thing anchoring him to this world. "I told you," he said, his voice trembling. "Evelyn, she's not what you think. She's been running things from the start. Jonathan was just a pawn. She used him, used all of us, to get what she wanted. "And what does she want?" Elliot pressed, his tone razor sharp. "Power," Cooper said simply. "Control. She doesn't care who gets hurt in the process, as long as she comes out on top." Elliot's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, waiting for Cooper to continue. "The records Margaret had," Cooper went on, his voice growing fainter with each word. "They tie Evelyn to everything. The bribes, the blackmail, the threats. Jonathan found out about it, but he thought he could handle it, thought he could keep her in check. He was wrong. Why kill him?" I asked, stepping closer. "If he was under her thumb, why not keep him there?" Cooper shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. He wasn't under her thumb anymore. He was going to expose her, blow the whole operation wide open. She couldn't risk it. None of them could. The weight of his words settled over the room, suffocating in its finality. Evelyn Aldridge, the grieving widow who had hired us to uncover the truth about her husband's death, was the orchestrator of it all. And now, with her grip on power threatened, she had sent her enforcers to tie up the loose ends. Elliot stood, his expression grim but resolute. "We need to move," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "They'll come for us next, and this office won't hold them off for long." I nodded, the revolver back in my hand as I moved to help Cooper to his feet. He let out a groan of pain as I pulled him upright, his legs shaking beneath him. "Can he make it?" I asked, looking to Elliot. "He doesn't have a choice," Elliot said. He grabbed his coat and a leather satchel filled with documents from his desk, slinging it over his shoulder. "We leave through the alley. With any luck, they won't spot us until we're already gone." The plan was simple, but the execution was anything but. The alley behind the office was narrow and strewn with trash, its exit leading onto a busy street where escape would be possible, but only if we reached it unnoticed. Elliot led the way, his movements quick and precise, his revolver drawn and ready. I followed close behind, half carrying, half dragging Cooper as he struggled to keep pace. We were halfway down the alley when the sound of raised voices reached us. I glanced back and saw shadows moving at the far end, the dark silhouettes of men entering the alley from the opposite direction. My heart jumped into my throat, but Elliot didn't falter. He quickened his pace, motioning for me to do the same. "Keep moving," he hissed, his voice low but urgent. The street was just ahead, its faint light a beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness of the alley. But as we neared the exit, the sharp crack of a gunshot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off the brick wall inches from my head. I ducked instinctively, pulling Cooper down with me as Elliot returned fire, his movements fluid and precise. "We're pinned," I shouted, my voice barely audible over the cacophony of gunfire. "Not yet," Elliot said, his tone icy calm. He motioned for me to stay low as he moved toward a stack of crates near the exit, using them as cover. His sharp eyes scanned the alley, assessing the situation with the detachment of a man who had been in far worse predicaments than this. Another shot rang out, this one hitting the crate just above Elliot's head. He didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his revolver and fired twice in quick succession, the muzzle flash illuminating his face for a split second. A grunt of pain followed, and one of the shadows crumpled to the ground. "Now!" Elliot shouted, motioning for me to move. "Go!" I didn't think. I just acted, pulling Cooper to his feet and half running, half stumbling toward the street. The sounds of gunfire and shouting followed us, but I didn't look back. All that mattered was reaching the light, the safety it promised. We burst onto the street, the sudden brightness almost blinding after the darkness of the alley. A taxi idling at the curb caught my eye, and without hesitation, I waved it down. The driver looked startled but didn't argue as Elliot climbed in behind us, his revolver still in hand. "Drive," Elliot said, his voice cold and commanding. "Now." The driver didn't need to be told twice. The car lurched forward, its tires screeching as it sped away from the alley and the danger lurking within. I collapsed against the seat, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the adrenaline began to fade. Cooper lay slumped beside me, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow but steady. Elliot sat across from us, his sharp gaze fixed out the window, scanning for any signs of pursuit. For a moment, none of us spoke, the silence filled only by the hum of the engine and the faint sounds of the city waking up around us. "We're not out of the woods yet," Elliot said finally, his voice breaking the silence. "But we're one step closer to what I didn't know." But as I looked at Elliot's resolute expression and the battered man beside me, I knew one thing for certain. The fight was far from over. The rhythmic hum of the plane's engine thrummed through the cabin, a deep, soothing vibration that seemed almost out of place given the tension hanging in the air. The private jet was sleek, its polished wood panels gleaming faintly in the soft lighting. But it wasn't luxury that filled the space. It was the oppressive weight of a deadly game reaching its conclusion. Elliot sat across from me, his sharp eyes scanning the folder in his lap. It was the last piece of the puzzle, a damning dossier of records extracted from Cooper's fractured memory and hastily written confessions. Names, accounts, deals, all tied back to Evelyn Aldridge. And now we were on our way to confront her at a secluded estate, the final battlefield where truth would either prevail or be swallowed whole by the shadowy forces that had pursued us relentlessly. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, my fingers drumming against the armrest as I stared out the window at the inky blackness beyond. "Do you think she knows we're coming?" I asked, my voice low to avoid disturbing the delicate balance of the moment. Elliot glanced up, his expression unreadable. "She always knows," he replied simply. "But that doesn't mean she's prepared." The plane touched down just before midnight, the landing smooth and eerily silent on the private airstrip that bordered Evelyn's sprawling estate. The air outside was cool and crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and earth. It was a stark contrast to the fire raging within me, a mix of anticipation, fear, and determination. Elliot led the way, his trench coat billowing slightly in the breeze as we crossed the open tarmac and approached the waiting car. The driver was silent as he opened the door for us, and we climbed in without a word, the leather seats creaking softly beneath our weight. The ride to the estate was short, the narrow road winding through dense woods that seemed to press in from all sides. When we arrived, the estate loomed before us like a fortress, its grand facade illuminated by the soft glow of strategically placed lights. The building was a testament to wealth and power, its towering columns and sprawling wings designed to intimidate and awe in equal measure. But tonight, it felt more like a stage set for a confrontation that had been building since the moment Jonathan Aldridge drew his last breath. Elliot didn't hesitate as he climbed the wide marble steps to the front door, his movements as precise and deliberate as ever. I followed close behind, my heart pounding as I gripped the folder tightly in one hand. When we reached the door, it swung open before we could knock, and there she stood, Evelyn Aldridge. She was radiant as always, her auburn hair perfectly styled, her dark eyes piercing and calculating. She wore an elegant black gown that shimmered faintly in the light, the epitome of grace and control. But there was something in her expression, something that betrayed a flicker of unease. "Mr. Brooks," she said smoothly, her voice like silk, "and Mr. Vasquez, to what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Elliot didn't waste time with pleasantries. He stepped inside, his presence commanding as he held out the folder. "You know why we're here, Evelyn." Her eyes flicked to the folder, then back to Elliot's face. For a moment, the mask slipped, and I saw something raw and unguarded in her gaze. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a faint smile. "Shall we discuss this in my study?" she suggested, her tone calm but edged with steel. She led us down a grand hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, the weight of their gazes seeming to follow us as we walked. The study was a luxurious space, its walls lined with bookshelves and its centerpiece a massive mahogany desk that gleamed in the firelight. Evelyn moved behind the desk, her movements graceful and deliberate as she turned to face us. "So," she said, folding her hands neatly in front of her, "let's have it, then." Elliot stepped forward, placing the folder on the desk with deliberate precision. "We know everything," he said, his voice steady but charged with quiet intensity. "The bribes, the blackmail, the threats. You used your husband as a pawn, and when he threatened to expose you, you had him killed." Evelyn's smile widened, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Bold accusations," she said, her voice smooth as glass. "Do you have proof?" Elliot flipped open the folder, revealing pages of incriminating documents and photographs. He began to speak, outlining each piece of evidence with the precision of a surgeon, his words slicing through Evelyn's composure like a scalpel. As he spoke, I watched her carefully, looking for cracks in the facade. And then I saw it. A flicker of something dark and dangerous passed through her eyes, a shadow of the ruthlessness that had propelled her to the top. She knew the game was up, but she wasn't going down without a fight. When Elliot finished, the room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her smile fading as she regarded us with cold calculation. "Well," she said finally, her voice low and measured, "you've certainly done your homework. But let me ask you this, Mr. Brooks. Do you truly believe that exposing me will change anything? Do you think the machine will stop turning simply because you've removed one cog?" Elliot didn't flinch. "It's not about stopping the machine," he said. "It's about holding the people who built it accountable." Evelyn laughed softly, the sound both bitter and amused. "You're a fool," she said, "but I suppose fools have their uses." Before either of us could react, she pressed a button hidden beneath the desk. The sound of heavy footsteps filled the hallway outside, and I turned just in time to see two large men enter the study, their expressions grim and their hands resting on holstered pistols. Elliot didn't move, his gaze fixed on Evelyn. "Is this how it ends, then?" he asked, his voice calm. "With more blood on your hands?" Evelyn's smile returned, cold and triumphant. "Oh, Mr. Brooks," she said softly, "it's not my hands you should be worried about." The men moved toward us, but before they could reach the desk, the sound of sirens pierced the night air. Red and blue lights flashed outside the study's large windows, casting eerie shadows across the room. Evelyn's composure cracked for the first time, her eyes widening in shock. Elliot smiled faintly, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "Did you really think we'd come here alone?" he asked. The doors burst open, and a swarm of federal agents filled the room, their weapons drawn. The two men hesitated, then raised their hands in surrender. Evelyn stood frozen, her perfect world crumbling around her as the agents moved in to arrest her. I watched as they led her away, her head held high even in defeat. It was a cinematic ending, the kind you'd expect to see in a noir film. Justice served, the villain unmasked, and the hero standing victorious. But as I turned to Elliot, I saw no triumph in his eyes, only the weight of the cost, the lives lost, the darkness uncovered, and the knowledge that the machine Evelyn had built was far from dismantled. "We did what we came to do," I said quietly, though the words felt hollow. Elliot nodded, his gaze distant as he watched the flashing lights fade into the distance. "We did," he said, "but the fight isn't over." And as we stepped into the night, the air crisp and cold against my skin, I couldn't help but wonder what battles lay ahead.